Welcome, learners, to today's lesson about integers. So, let us start off with an interesting fact. Did you know the answer to a real number being squared will always be positive? In the whole number system, no matter how much you search, there is no number that you can multiply by itself or square that will ever give you a negative answer. Think about it. This means that when you have a negative under a square root, the number is non-real or imaginary. Isn't that amazing? Let's look at today's lesson objectives. So, by the end of this lesson, you must be able to perform calculations with integers involving multiplication and division, use commutative, associative, and distributive properties of multiplication for integers, perform calculations involving squares, cubes, square roots, and cube roots of integers. And lastly, solve problems in contexts using multiple operations with integers. Let's look at the focus for today's lesson. So we are going to be looking at calculations with integers, that is, multiplication and division with integers, and integers that involve squares, cubes, square roots, and cube roots of integers. We are also going to be looking at properties of integers. So that is the multiplicative inverse for integers and the commutative, associative, and distributive properties of integers. Let's look at the things that you are supposed to know from your pre-knowledge or the things that you have learned previously. So the first one is that you are supposed to be able to perform calculations using multiplication and division with whole numbers. Also, you are supposed to be able to know how to determine the square numbers, the square roots, the cube numbers, and the cube roots of whole numbers. Let's look at some words that you are supposed to know that we are going to be using throughout this lesson. Square numbers, the value you get when you multiply a number by itself once. For example, 4 times 4, which is 4 squared, and the answer is 16. 16 is the square number. Square roots, the number that was multiplied by itself to get the square number. The number where a square number comes from. So for example, the square root of 16. We know that 16 comes from 4 times 4, which is 4 squared, and the answer there will be 4. So 4 is the square root of 16. Cube numbers, the value you get when you multiply a number by itself 2 times. For example, 2 times 2 times 2. That is 2 cubed, and the answer there is 8. So 8 is the cube number. Cube root, the number that was multiplied by itself 2 times to get the cube number. The number where a cube number comes from. For example, the cube root of 8. That is the cube root of 2 times 2 times 2. So the cube root of 2 cubed is 2. So 2 is the cube root. Okay, let's look at some questions and see if we remember. So if I am multiplying 2 whole numbers, 5 times 8, remember that multiplication is also commutative. This means that I can also say 8 times 5. Whether we say 5 times 8 or 8 times 5, the answer will be the same, which is 40. That is just to remind you that multiplication is commutative. So 6 times 3. This can also be calculated as 3 times 6. And our answer there is 18. Let's look at 3 times 2 times 7. Remember, multiplication is also associative. This means that we can group the numbers together before multiplying everything else. So I can say 3 times 2, which will give me 6. And then later on, multiply the 7. Then what is 6 times 7? Our answer is 42. We can also say 3 multiplied by, then I start with the 2 times 7, which is 14. What is 3 times 14? My answer will still be 42. 2. So that is just to remind you that multiplication is associative with whole numbers. Now, if we are going to determine the square and the square roots of whole numbers, so I have there 4 squared. What does 4 squared mean? That is 4 times 4. And 4 times 4 is 16. What is the square root of 16? Now, because 16 comes from 4 times 4, that means that the square root of 4 squared will be 4. So the square root of 16 is 4. The same thing with 8 squared. That will be 8 times 8. That will give me 64. So 8 squared is 64. And then when we are looking at the square root of 64, so we know that 64 comes from 8 times 8. That means that it comes from 8 squared. And my answer for the square root of 64 will be 8. Let's look at some cube numbers. So if I have 4 cubed, that is 4 times 4 times 4. Which gives me, yes, you have it, it is 64. So what does that mean for the cube root of 64? So because we know that the 64 comes from 4 times 4 times 4, that means it comes from the cube root of 4 cubed, and the answer there is 4. The same thing for 5 cubed. That means 5 times 5 times 5, and our answer there is 125. Let's look at now the cube root of 125. We know that 125 does come from 5 times 5 times 5. And then that means that the cube root of 5 cubed. And our answer there is going to be 5. So the cube root of 125 is 5. So let's look at a new word that we are going to be using during this lesson, and that is the multiplicative inverse or the reciprocal. The multiplicative inverse is the number that you multiply with another number to get 1. For example, the multiplicative inverse of 1/2 is 2, because 1/2 multiplied by 2 is equals to 1. So the reciprocal of 1/2 is 2. Okay, let's go to an ad break and then we'll see you just now.